Welcome to the KIX EAP Podcast, your monthly podcast with important leaders in education from Eastern Europe, Middle East and North Africa, Central Asia, and the Asia Pacific. I'm your host, Ryan Allen, assistant professor at Chapman University here in Southern California, and my own background is in international and comparative education. Let's start the show. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Sajid Ali, who is the Amir, Sultan Chinoy Associate Professor at the Aga Khan University's Institute for Educational Development in Pakistan. In our conversation, we talk about his educational journey, then we get into his research and the Institute, and we close with a critical reflection on international development work in the country. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. Sajid, thank you for joining me today. It's nice to finally get to sit down with you here. Going through your CV, it's really interesting to kind of see your background, and I'm curious how you got into education, because I see here that you actually started in journalism, or you did a BA in journalism at the University of Karachi. So can you maybe talk a little bit about like sort of moving over from maybe journalism or communications into education? And I know you also went abroad as well, so maybe some of those choices as well.
Interestingly, if you go even downwards in my CV, I started like my high school inclination and subjects were physics, chemistry, maths. So I was aiming to go into engineering field or computer softwares or those kinds of things. But eventually I ended up pursuing social sciences. And in the bachelor's, I had three options, and communication and journalism was one of them. But I also had a major in sociology at that time. And then in my master's from Karachi University, I pursued my master's in sociology. Now, from that to the journey in education was a result of my early experience, employment experience with Aga Khan University's Institute for Educational Development, where I am currently working. So one of my professors was working on a research project with this institute from sociology, and it was kind of a social educational linkages that were there. That brought me to this institute. I was exposed to the field of education, and eventually, but I think I would rather call myself sociologist of education, because I didn't pursue my interest in the pedagogy or in teaching this subject or that subject. I was more curious on the issues of policy, on the issues of educational leadership, what affects education system as a whole. So that's how I find the link between my early qualifications and the field of education. And as I got interested into that, I pursued my further education. So I did a master's in education from Monash, and if you could see, that master's was also in the education policy and leadership. And then eventually I pursued my PhD from University of Edinburgh.
Yeah, I'm curious about those choices. So you do a degree in sociology in Australia, and then you move to the University of Edinburgh for your PhD. Can you maybe talk a little bit about, I think one issue that scholars often face when they do a degree abroad is either stay in that country, the host country, or go back to home country, and I'm kind of curious about that experience and just what went into thinking there.
Very interesting question, actually. And probably that is a question that people more so from the southern countries, because this face than probably people from northern countries or the developed country for that matter, because the opportunities are similar. So if you talk about opportunities between USA, Australia, UK, or European countries, probably they are similar with some variation. But if you look at the prospects of scholars in the South or underdeveloped countries and the prospects in for example, Australia, USA, it's huge difference. So not only me, I guess anybody who is traveling from the South to the North or underdeveloped or less developed to a developed context get qualification, get exposed to that culture, and find their feet, confront this question, where to stay, where to pursue. And I think I probably resolved this question very early, because I wanted the focus and concentration. I thought, and I still remember confronting this question. And I thought probably the kind of things that I'm getting exposed to myself, the scholarship, the field, and everything would probably be useful for the context, to say UK or Australia, but more so for the context of Pakistan, where I grew up, where I think what I can contribute is more significant. I can return, I can go back to that context and try and talk to more of my students, do more scholarship. I think it was the sense of contribution that I felt towards the hosts, towards my country of birth, that I always thought of returning, and I always plan to return. And if you look at my master's thesis, because that choice determines your choice of topic, your choice of field of scholarship. So if you see my master's from Australia or the PhD from Edinburgh, both of these research is focused mainly on education policy in Pakistan. And so I was very clear from the choice of my topic that I would be returning, because in Edinburgh, if I had to pursue my career, people would be asking that, well, look, your PhD thesis would be great for Pakistan, but what lessons can you draw from here to the work in Edinburgh? Those were some of the thoughts. And apart from that, I'm a family person. I always thought of returning to my family. And so it was that kind of a thinking at that time. And I think I'm not regretting it. It's been like 20 years since Australia and probably 12 years since Edinburgh. So I'm okay. But always nice to go to those contexts just to get more stimulated.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate sort of diving into that question and really interrogating, who has to make that choice, or who's sort of confronted with those issues, and can definitely appreciate sort of making decisions based on family and these other connections. So thank you for getting into that. If we could, I would like to talk about your current position. Can you talk a little bit about the Institute of Education Development at Aga Khan University? And I noticed you teach a lot of research methodology, and you have a lot of doc students. So can you kind of talk about your role there, and maybe who are your students, and maybe what do they go on to do?
Thank you very much for bringing the Institute, and probably connected to the previous question about returning. I think the Institute itself played a very vital role in helping me to make that decision, because I was facilitated by my Institute a lot. So anytime, whether I go to Australia or UK, the Institute allowed me long leaves, which is rare. In our context, apart from public sector university, because public sector universities generally have more flexible approaches, more possibilities of giving long leaves. But private sector universities are not very good at that kind of a thing. So I should appreciate my university and my institute for allowing me to do that. And I think introducing what I do in the Institute, let me first introduce, or at least briefly give you the context of the Institute, what this Institute is generally about, as I understand, because probably I started my career as a research assistant, but between 2019 and 21, for 2 years, I was also the interim dean of the Institute. So I actually started my career and ended up heading the Institute itself. Currently, I am the associate professor, as I told you. I've got the endowed professorship, Amir Sultan Chinoy professorship, which is a high privilege within the context of the Institute. Only 3 of the faculty has endowed professorship. I'm pursuing towards professorship, but I'm still not there. I still have to do a little more work. apart from my teaching and research, I'm also heading the research portfolio. So I'm the director of research here. And prior to that, I was the interim dean. So I've done lots of these roles as well, heading the research, heading the graduate programs portfolio, heading the PhD doctoral portfolio. And so those are the kinds of things that are there. In my teaching scholarship research role, my area where I generally pursue my research are what we generally describe as comparative international education as a broad field. And I generally draw on the issues of globalization, educational governance. So when I look at governance, I generally look at either policy implementation, I look at policy formulation, I look at public-private partnerships. When we look at globalization, I generally look at how, for example, donors or consultants or all these development partners affect the national education policy formulation, which was also one of the foci of my PhD research. I also look at the leadership and management issues within the school community, school context, and how, for example, leadership affects the school dynamics. Currently, I'm working with around 10 head teachers to offer a workshop for COVID and how the COVID affected the educational context, the schooling context, and the lessons learned from them, and allowing those lessons to be transferred to other people. In terms of my teaching, my teaching also revolves around these areas: education policy, policy implementation, and those. My research currently, I am pursuing quite a lot of interest in the area of teacher licensing, teaching license, and I engage a lot with the ministries, with the policy network around, and hopefully next month, June, we will be launching a white paper on teaching license in Pakistan after a lot of policy advocacy, policy dialogues, work, research, synthesis of all of those things over a period of year. I've looked at the issues related to policy implementation. My current paper in CIES, Comparative International Education Society Conference, was on policy implementation, and how, for example, this short-term, short-sighted project-based implementation creates disruptions rather than continuation, and affects more negatively than positively because of that time bar, because of the pressures of the donors to deliver in time. Those are the kinds of things. I supervise a lot of the students. We offer the Institute offer Masters in Education, and MPhil in Education, and PhD in Education. And it's probably the best institute or faculty of education in Pakistan, for sure. The university itself, if you look at our university, it's spread over a number of different countries. So it's in Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria. So and we have a campus in London. So it's a multi-campus university as well. So that allows us some comparative thinking, comparative discussions. So I think it's in a stimulating context for a scholar in the South, as far as Al Khan University Institute for Educational Development is considered. And so with that stimulation, I also pursue different research with my students. One of my students is conceptualizing on the issue of public-private partnerships in Pakistan. The other doctoral student is working on the issue of education policy implementation. Then a teaching license, I just told you. Some others are pursuing educational leadership during COVID disruptions. So these are some of the things that I do. I can tell you more about the Institute if you want, or any of the things that I just...
Yeah, that's wonderful. I was looking at the website before we started the conversation, and I saw those different global connections, and you talked about some of those maybe South-South connections, and that's really wonderful to see, and a great opportunity to do comparative research that might not get talked about in different journals and things like that. Like you were talking about, sort of having to focus on a specific issue when you're in Edinburgh, and it might be different than in Pakistan. So that's wonderful to see. Can we maybe dive more into your research? I see you have a fairly recent article in Globalization, Society, and Education, which is a wonderful journal, and you have a book, an edited book volume coming out fairly soon with University of Oxford Press. I'm interested in a lot of your areas of research, and you have so many. So maybe you could kind of jump into those two first, and then if we can see where we go from there.
One of the beauty of working in the Southern context is the field is so open to a variety of challenges that you can pursue many interests simultaneously. So one of the probably limitation for a scholar in the North is you have to be very, very specific towards the field of research that you want to pursue. So I think that's the advantage of working as a scholar in the South. So you can pursue one of the areas that I'm currently interested in, which I haven't mentioned yet, and I'm still conceptualizing it, youth illiteracy and adult literacy. So a lot of my research is also, or my areas of interest are also defined by the need of the context. So all the areas that I've mentioned have emerged from my understanding of what my scholarship can contribute to the existing need of research and scholarship within our context. So public-private partnership is the main instrument that is being pursued by the state currently. Now, for understanding that, you also have to understand that Pakistan is the country which has second highest out of school children population. So 25 million children are out of school. Our adult literacy rate is also roughly around in 60s. So a lot of illiterate population and a growing number of private schools. So around 30% of our institutions are in private schools. Now you look into all of these issues, and then the government's preference for public-private partnerships and different donor preference for public-private partnership. I think any scholar who would be in my place would be curious to know why, for example, this particular policy is being pursued, given all of these things. And yet, interestingly, the government committed even more constitutionally. It said that the state will provide free and compulsory education from K-12, roughly, from ages 5 to 16. So huge commitment, but when you look at the delivery, rising privatization, rising public-private partnerships, so you tend to ask these kinds of questions. And that makes me curious in those areas. The other thing is, and then if you connect it to, okay, if that may be how those decisions are made of pursuing this pathway or that pathway, and then you get interested into what I wrote in my article that you referred to in Globalization, Societies, and Education, which is actually asking about the spheres of authority. That if a state is supposed to have the maximum authority to determine its policy, whether that's an absolute authority or whether that authority is disjuncted by various pressures that a state has to meet. And so that's mainly the kind of question that I work within that article. And so what I eventually said that states in the South, borrowing Bourdieu's argument that we have less national capital, and national capital is determined obviously by financial capital, but also your connection and everything. So I said Pakistan, for example, is weak in national capital, obviously financial capital, and so it has to negotiate between different pressures. So if donors come with the education development budget, you have to listen to them. And if there are demands from the global agencies like UN or World Bank or IMF, you have to listen to them as well. And then any development. So a state ended up, instead of determining the educational foci or the main pathway, ended up negotiating between all of these spheres of pressures. And so that's what I try. And so I said that in our context, mainly the state is doing more of the soft governance rather than hard governance, which is to assert itself through negotiation, through consultation, through using some soft instruments rather than hard instruments. So those are the kinds of things that I dealt with. And I also pursued that. One of the other writing I did after that was about the role of the network governance, which is also a result of that, because if you look at the policy development process, and I've witnessed quite a lot working with the ministries, that state is performing what is called now the network governance, where the role of consultants is very prominent, but also how, for example, the consultation is also used by the state itself as an instrument of juxtaposing one pressure against another pressure and then negotiating its way forward. So those are some of the areas that I pursued in my writing. I don't know whether I missed anything that you asked or
no. That was great. That was great. Yeah, I mean, it was kind of just a question to sort of to see, you know, where you were thinking and some of your interests, and that was actually really wonderful.
Yeah, and one thing I just remembered. So just to give you a sense of how I am into a variety of areas. So now you can see the connection of my interest in the public-private partnership and globalization and donor, and how I see them connected. And then if you look at the youth literacy of the same context, so one bit of that is privatization of education and public-private partnership. But then you also look, for example, that adult illiteracy is huge. And so I became curious, and I'm still curious. I'm still formulating my thoughts around so the question that I'm pursuing is how can we make our illiterate youth literate and employable at the same time? Because one of the reasons the youth is not pursuing this education or drop out, it has to do a lot with the prevailing poverty and the need to support their families. So they cannot discontinue from the employment, which is needed, and their family, their own survival depends on that. So can we use their workplaces as means for giving them some kind of education, even functional education, which is connected with their work, but also literacy. So I don't have response. I only have question. Let's see whether I pursue that area enough or not. But those are some of the thoughts that keep popping in my head, and I'm blessed with my students. So one of the advantages of pursuing multiple interests is also a huge variety of students' body. So every year we are allocated to master's students, and I think our institute pay a lot of attention to these students, allow time and effort. So when, for example, last year I had interest in leadership and COVID, I asked two of my students to pursue that area. And they are pursuing that area of interest. That also keep me updated. We have written, we are planning to write something. And so this keeps these different interests alive in parallel.
Yeah, that sounds great. What I love about that is you're sort of still exploring and trying to find those answers. And I hope, you know, a couple of years from now, maybe when we see you again on the podcast or in a conference or whatever it is, you have the answer then, or you're presenting a paper or you're publishing a paper. And the other thing I love with that is that, you know, you're connecting this with your students. So it's you're sort of sharing this knowledge or building out this experience. So that's just wonderful. We're kind of coming to the end of the interview. And you keyed on something that I'm quite interested in, and I often ask my guest, what is sort of a message that we can give to people, you know, outside of Pakistan that maybe they don't realize, or that's maybe from your perspective, it's better to understand, rather than sort of someone coming in and saying, hey, this is the problem, or this is what you need. Like, do you have a message or thought on maybe that kind of balancing act between sort of a local who has that perspective and sort of these international agencies that might be coming.
So some of the messages are hidden within the work that I do or matters that I publish. But I think one of the messages I would like to give to international community, especially development community, is that I don't know. Do you, Ryan, have any sense of 5 years capping of the projects or development activities? I think it has to do something with the 5 years length of the government. That any government generally pursues 4 or 5 years of agenda, and then the new administration comes in, and then they define their development agenda. So that's the only thought that I have. If that is the thinking, that I question that thinking, because that may work for that community. So if, for example, USAID, which is very prominent in Pakistan, is working, they come up with 5 years agenda, but sometimes these agendas are so different that it just confuses the local context. So prior to, I think, Obama administration, USAID investment was heavily towards teachers' professional development in Pakistan. And with the change of administration, suddenly USAID started funding the reading program. And so one would wonder, what is this discontinuation? So there are lots of disjunctures. And so my message to the international community and development agencies is that allow their team on the ground to assess and be flexible with these timelines, with this agenda setting, negotiation. So there's a lot of rhetoric, and generally before any development partner coming to the context, they generally talk to the government, they generally talk to people to assess what is needed. But what I've observed is they generally come with a set mind. Even whatever suggestion you give, they sell what they have to sell. It's more like a marketing company, which is making, say, Pepsi Cola or Coca-Cola or maybe Ariel or whatever, detergent powder or anything. They would sell it anyway. They would listen to you. They would do everything. But in the end, they would just find a way to sell you the thing that they want to sell. So that kind of an approach, I think, is detrimental to the very nature of the development work, these disjunctures. So this discontinuation and agenda setting. So some of the development agencies are quite good. For example, JICA is more engaging and working all this. Sorry, I'm naming these, but I hope these agencies don't mind. But even if you mind, this is kind of an advice that if you learn from, for example, the work of an agency that is appreciated by the local context, there is some lesson for you. But look, this is the kind of working together, flexibility, more thinking. So maybe you achieve a DLI, development link indicator, but you miss the objective. That's the kind of tragedy that is taking place. So that's my agenda or request to the donor community. The second message is about the scholarship, the kind of research that is being carried out in the development context. If you remember, Kenneth King used to talk about, and it still talks about, this consultancy research. And so if you look at, in our context in Pakistan, a lot of research is basically consultancy research, which generally is a result of a TOR, which is already circulated, and a consultant who is a researcher respond to that TORs. So agenda setting of the research is in the hands of those agencies that hire consultancy. And they are often very, very micro. So we know we rely on funding agencies for our research as well, but generally many of, for example, ESRC in UK, or some of the broader funding agencies whose assessment criteria is also determined by the scholars. They are more flexible, more open. But this consultancy research is generally very, very focused, very, very micro, and often in the form of impact studies or evaluation study. And so at best, it benefits that project, evaluates whether the project works or does not work. And what it does harm is that it engages many useful, able local minds towards that consultancy research. Because not every university, like my university, allow you to determine your agenda, provide you support. And I think I appreciate my institute again that it does that. It allows some internal funding to support your initial thoughts and ideas, which is not the case in many other private universities, and some independent scholars who generally end up becoming more of consultant. I see there are brilliant minds in Pakistan who are working on consultancy research and this, but often, so their mind is generally used to serve that consultancy research agenda rather than forming an independent educational research agenda, and then linking it with the policy advice. And so that connection is not as strong as it is supposed to be in the research policy action arena. We are making one effort. I told you about teaching license. We tried to do an independent analysis, policy dialogue, and everything. So our effort on teaching license wasn't sponsored by any sponsoring agency. It is generally the work that university allowed me to carry out. And so we are working with the ministries. We are working with teachers union. We are working with. So it allows you the flexibility, which otherwise you won't have the time. So I work with different stakeholders, and now even with the final white paper, we are setting it into the public domain by saying, well, look, this is our best advice at the moment. But we are still open, and you can look at it. We are happy to give you more advice, more evidence, more support, but generally it's up to you. So that advice to the research community, to our national government, is just the advice that please pay attention to the research and allow some funds, national funds, to carry out those research as well. I think that's kind of my message. At the moment, I don't know whether I make very concrete messaging, but I think if people can listen to me and interact with my thoughts, they might get the message out of it.
Yeah, no, I think so. That was wonderful. You know, a little bit of a critique on sort of the international community and maybe some domestic advice as well. So you left a lot for us to sort of ponder as we end this podcast, and definitely link to your work if people want to go read more about it. And hopefully we'll see you at other events and organizations and things like that.
Just to interrupt you, I think I should also appreciate this KIX initiative, because that's also allowing. So I participated in the webinar, which resulted in this podcast, where I think one scholar from Europe, one scholar from UK, the other one from Egypt, and myself. I think there was a lot of interaction, and we were talking about Paulo Freire, and I think how it affects in different contexts. I think those are the kinds of things are very important, and I think I should appreciate this KIX initiative. And I think if it is pursued, it would allow more of such interactive discussion, discourse, and one thing leads to the other. So that thing led to this might lead to some other thing. And those are the organic things that we need to support more. Sorry, I cut your.
No,
I think that's an important one.
Absolutely. That is important, and we definitely appreciate it. And you're right, this capacity building of, you meet someone here or you do this event and it goes somewhere else. And that's how we sort of create those different synergies, I think. So I do agree with you there. So, all right. Well, thank you for joining me today, and we'll have to cross paths again, hopefully.
Hopefully. Thank you.
And this concludes our KIX EAP podcast, which is released every first Wednesday of the month. Of course, the opinions expressed on the KIX EAP podcast are solely those of the host and the guest. The KIX EAP podcast is made possible by KIX, which stands for Knowledge and Innovation Exchange. KIX is an initiative of the Global Partnership for Education. Globally, KIX is administered by the International Development Research Center in Canada. NORAG in Geneva hosts one of the 4 regional hubs of KIX. Find us on the NORAG or GPE KIX websites. You can subscribe to the KIX EAP podcast, newsletter, and webinar series, and also learn about KIX global or regional projects. Additionally, you can subscribe directly on Spotify or SoundCloud to receive notifications of the new monthly podcast episodes. Thanks for listening.